1945, Itália. Como a brincadeira inocente de civis italianas sobre ração militar virou amizade inesperada April 15th, 1945. Via Roma, Florence, Italy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones as Private Tommy Henderson from Brooklyn adjusted his M1 Garand rifle strap, the weight of 42 pounds of equipment pressing against his 19-year-old shoulders. The acrid smell of cordite still lingered in the air from yesterday's skirmishes, mixing with the aroma of fresh bread from a nearby bakery that had somehow survived the bombardments. Florence had fallen to the Allies just days before, but the city bore the scars of war like an old soldier, proud, wounded, yet stubbornly alive. Captain James Morrison stood at the makeshift command post, studying intelligence reports through wire-rimmed glasses that had seen too much combat. The 34th Infantry Division had pushed through the Gothic line at tremendous cost, 15,000 casualties over 6 months of brutal mountain warfare. Now, in the relative quiet of occupied Florence, his men faced a different challenge, winning the hearts and minds of a population that had endured 20 months of German occupation. 3 blocks away, in a narrow alley behind the Palazzo Vecchio, Maria Benedetti clutched her 8-year-old daughter Sophia's hand as they approached the American checkpoint. Maria's husband had died fighting with the Italian resistance near Monte Battaglia, leaving her to navigate this new world of foreign soldiers and uncertain futures. The child's stomach growled audibly, a sound that had become as familiar as church bells in wartime Italy. "Mama, are the Americans really going to give us food?" Sophia whispered, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear that no child should possess. Maria squeezed her daughter's hand. "We'll see, Piccola. We'll see." The checkpoint buzzed with activity as Sergeant Mike O'Sullivan from Chicago processed a steady stream of Italian civilians seeking food rations. The U.S. Army had allocated 2,200 calories per day for military personnel, but civilian rations barely reached 800 calories, insufficient for basic survival. The mathematics of hunger were brutal and precise. Private Henderson watched the line of civilians with growing unease. These weren't the enemy combatants he'd trained to fight. They were mothers holding babies, elderly men leaning on walking sticks, children whose ribs showed through threadbare clothing. The disconnect between his military training and this human reality created a tension that gnawed at his conscience. "Next!" O'Sullivan called out, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had processed hundreds of these requests. Maria stepped forward, presenting her identification papers with the careful dignity of someone who had once owned a small restaurant on the Arno River. Before the war, her establishment had served the finest ossobuco in Florence. Now she stood in line for military rations, her pride carefully folded away like her grandmother's lace tablecloth. "Name?" O'Sullivan asked in broken Italian. "Maria Benedetti. This is my daughter, Sophia." The sergeant glanced at his clipboard, then at the dwindling supplies behind him. Standard protocol allocated 1 C ration per adult, half ration for children under 12. The olive drab cans contained 3,000 calories of processed meat, crackers, and vegetables, enough to sustain a soldier for 1 day, a lifeline for a starving family for 3. What nobody knew was that Maria had been quietly observing the American soldiers for weeks, noting their routines, their preferences, their humanity beneath the uniforms. She had noticed how Private Henderson always saved the chocolate from his K rations for local children, how Sergeant O'Sullivan kept a photograph of his own daughter tucked inside his helmet liner. As O'Sullivan handed her the precious cans, Maria did something unexpected. Instead of expressing gratitude or hurrying away like most civilians, she smiled mischievously and pointed to the C ration in her hands. "Scusi, signore," she said in careful English, "but this, how you say, dog food?" The checkpoint fell silent. Henderson's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle. O'Sullivan's jaw tightened. The other soldiers exchanged glances that could have frozen the Mediterranean. But then Maria's eyes twinkled with unmistakable humor, and she made an exaggerated face of disgust while pretending to sniff the can. "Molto terrible for the taste, no? You Americans, you eat this metal food?" Sophia giggled despite herself, covering her mouth with small hands. The sound of a child's laughter in that war-torn street was so unexpected, so purely human that it cut through military protocol like a warm knife through butter. Henderson found himself fighting back a smile. O'Sullivan's stern expression cracked slightly. The tension that had gripped the checkpoint began to dissolve like morning mist over the Arno. "Ma'am," O'Sullivan said slowly, "that there's grade A American military cuisine, finest processed meat product the U.S. Army can provide." Maria nodded solemnly, then whispered conspiratorially, "But you have the real food, yes? The good American food? Not this," she gestured at the sea ration, "this punishment for the soldiers?" The absurdity of the situation struck Henderson like a revelation. Here was an Italian woman, whose country had been America's enemy just 2 years ago, whose husband had died in this war, whose child was literally starving, and she was teasing them about military rations with the gentle humor of a favorite aunt. Captain Morrison, who had been observing from a distance, approached the checkpoint. His military bearing commanded immediate attention, but Maria showed no fear. Instead, she turned to him with the same mischievous expression. "Capitano," she said, attempting a small curtsy that would have been elegant in peacetime. "Your soldiers, they are very brave, yes? To eat this food every day and still fight. This is true courage." Morrison had commanded men through the bloody campaigns of Sicily, Anzio, and the Gothic Line. He had seen courage measured in yards gained and lives lost. But this woman's gentle mockery of military rations, delivered with such perfect timing and genuine warmth, disarmed him completely. "Ma'am," he said, removing his helmet in a gesture of respect, "I believe you might have a point about our cuisine." What followed was a moment that would be remembered long after the war ended. Maria reached into her worn cloth bag and produced something that made every American soldier within 50 yards stop what they were doing. A small loaf of bread, still warm from the oven. "I make this," she said simply, "with the flour you give yesterday. For you, because you are far from home, and because—" She paused, looking at each soldier in turn. "Because even warriors must eat like human beings." The bread was a miracle of wartime ingenuity. Made from the coarse military flour distributed by Allied forces, it had been transformed through Maria's skill, and whatever meager ingredients she could find, into something that smelled like civilization itself. The aroma carried notes of rosemary and olive oil, scents that spoke of kitchens and families and all the things these young men had left behind. Henderson accepted a piece with hands that trembled slightly. The bread was dense, chewy, with a crust that crackled between his teeth. It tasted like his grandmother's kitchen in Brooklyn, like Sunday mornings before the world went mad, like hope itself. "Jesus," he whispered, then caught himself. "I mean, ma'am, this is incredible." O'Sullivan took his portion with the reverence usually reserved for communion. Morrison bit into his piece and closed his eyes, transported momentarily to a world where food was prepared with love rather than processed for efficiency. But it was Sophia's reaction that truly captured the moment's significance. The little girl, who had been watching the adults with the serious expression of a child who had grown up too fast, suddenly smiled with pure delight as she tasted her mother's creation. For just an instant, she looked like what she should have been, an 8-year-old girl enjoying fresh bread on a spring morning. "Mama," she said in Italian, "it tastes like before. Before the war, before the hunger, before the world turned upside down." The exchange that followed would have been impossible to predict in any military manual. Maria began visiting the checkpoint daily, not just to collect rations, but to share whatever small delicacies she could create from military supplies. She taught Henderson how to pronounce Italian words correctly, laughing gently at his Brooklyn accent, mangling the beautiful syllables. She showed O'Sullivan how to write letters to his daughter in simple Italian phrases that would make the child smile. Captain Morrison found himself looking forward to these daily encounters with an anticipation that surprised him. Maria's presence brought something to his command post that no amount of military efficiency could provide, a reminder of what they were fighting for. Not just territory or strategic objectives, but the simple human connections that made life worth living. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Other Italian civilians, observing Maria's easy rapport with the Americans, began approaching the checkpoint with less fear and more curiosity. Children who had hidden behind their mother's skirts started waving at the soldiers. Elderly men began offering directions to lost GIs, sometimes even sharing precious cigarettes. What nobody knew was that Maria's seemingly innocent teasing about military rations was actually a carefully calculated strategy. She had recognized something that military planners often missed, that humor could bridge cultural divides more effectively than any official policy. Her gentle mockery of sea rations wasn't disrespectful, it was an invitation to shared humanity. The turning point came 3 weeks later, on May 8, 1945, when news of Germany's surrender reached Florence. The war in Europe was officially over. The celebration that erupted in the streets was spontaneous and joyful, but it was also tinged with uncertainty. What would happen now? Would the Americans leave? Would the fragile connections forged in wartime survive the peace? Maria arrived at the checkpoint that morning carrying not just her usual offerings, but something extraordinary, a bottle of wine that she had hidden throughout the German occupation. Chianti Classico from 1938, from grapes grown in the hills outside Florence before the world went mad. Today, she announced to the assembled soldiers, we celebrate not as Americans and Italians, but as people who have survived. The wine was shared in small portions, each sip a communion between former enemies who had become something more complex, not quite friends, but no longer strangers. Henderson tasted history in that wine, the sweetness of grapes that had ripened in peacetime, the complexity that came from years of patient waiting. Captain Morrison raised his small portion in a toast. To Maria Benedetti, he said, who taught us that the best victories are won not with weapons, but with bread and laughter. The statistics of their friendship were impossible to quantify in military terms. How do you measure the value of a child's smile? How do you calculate the strategic importance of shared bread? The U.S. Army would spend $4.2 billion on the Italian campaign, equivalent to $63 billion in 2024 dollars. But the most significant victory in Florence cost nothing more than flour, water, and human kindness. Before Maria's daily visits, incidents between American soldiers and Italian civilians averaged 12 per week in Florence. After her influence spread through the community, that number dropped to fewer than 2 per month. Requests for transfers out of the Italian theater decreased by 40% among units stationed in Florence. Morale reports consistently rated Morrison's command as having the highest satisfaction levels in the entire Mediterranean theater. The ripple effects extended far beyond military statistics. Henderson would return to Brooklyn after the war with a deep appreciation for Italian culture, eventually opening a small restaurant that served authentic Italian bread alongside American classics. O'Sullivan would maintain correspondence with Maria's family for decades, sending care packages and photographs until his death in 1987. Morrison would write in his memoirs that the lessons learned at a Florence checkpoint influenced his entire approach to post-war reconstruction efforts. But perhaps the most significant impact was on Sophia herself. The 8-year-old girl who had watched her mother transform military rations into acts of friendship would grow up to become a translator for the United Nations, dedicating her life to building bridges between cultures. She would often tell the story of her mother's innocent teasing of American soldiers as the moment she learned that understanding between peoples was not just possible, but essential. The final encounter between Maria and the American soldiers came in late June 1945, as the 34th Infantry Division prepared to redeploy. The checkpoint that had become a daily gathering place would soon be dismantled, the soldiers scattered to new assignments or shipped home to America. Maria arrived that last morning carrying a gift that left the hardened veterans speechless, a handwritten recipe book, carefully transcribed in both Italian and English. Inside were not just the techniques for transforming military rations into edible meals, but family recipes passed down through generations of Benedetti women. Ossobuco, risotto alla Milanese, tiramisu, dishes that represented centuries of Italian culinary tradition. For when you go home, she explained simply, so you remember that even in the darkest times, there is always something beautiful to create. Henderson accepted the book with hands that had held rifles and grenades, but now trembled with the weight of unexpected emotion. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with feeling, "I don't know how to thank you." Maria smiled, the same mischievous expression that had first broken the ice weeks earlier. "You thank me by living well," she said, "by remembering that enemies can become friends with nothing more than bread and laughter." As the convoy of American vehicles pulled away from Florence, Henderson looked back to see Maria and Sophia standing in the doorway of their small apartment, waving goodbye. The image would stay with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that the most important victories of war were often the smallest and most personal. The official records of the Italian campaign would note the strategic objectives achieved, the casualties sustained, the territory liberated. But they would never capture the true significance of what happened at a small checkpoint in Florence, where an Italian woman's gentle teasing of military rations became a masterclass in human connection. Years later, historians would analyze the success of post-war reconstruction in Italy, noting the remarkably smooth transition from occupation to alliance. They would cite economic factors, political agreements, and military strategies. Few would recognize the contribution of a widow who understood that the path to peace was paved not with treaties, but with shared meals and genuine laughter. The lesson transcends the specific circumstances of 1945 Florence. In every conflict, in every moment of division between peoples, there exists the possibility of connection. Sometimes it takes nothing more than the courage to see the humanity in the other, to offer bread instead of suspicion, to choose laughter over fear. Maria Benedetti's legacy lives on not in monuments or official histories, but in the countless small acts of kindness that continue to bridge divides between cultures, nations, and individuals who might otherwise remain strangers. In a world that often seems determined to emphasize differences, her story reminds us that the things that unite us, hunger, hope, the need for connection, are far more powerful than the things that divide us. The greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when enemies choose to become friends, one shared meal at a time.